Welcome to the Belonging Project podcast. This is Fiorenza and I'm your host. The purpose of this podcast is to bring voices together to talk about belonging. Through inspiring, real-life conversations, we explore how belonging can show up in so many different ways, what it feels like to belong, and the impact of truly belonging. Each episode will offer you inspiration and practical strategies to find your true voice in your life and as a leader. Let's dive in. Hi Mehdi, how are you?
Hi Fiorenza, I'm great, thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you so much for being here with me today on the Belonging Project podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you and to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. I really look forward to it. So I look forward to us jumping in and sharing together and learning from one another, hopefully.
Yeah, I hope so too. That's the plan. That's the plan, at least.
Great.
Maybe we can start with you telling us a little bit about you, your journey, whatever you feel like sharing with us today.
Thank you. I'll try my best. It's always odd talking about oneself because I guess it's not necessarily something one is used to. But I'll share with those listening in that we share quite a few things in common because I was born and raised in France, so I am French, and don't hold it against me. I have no say in the matter; it just happened that way. So I'm a very proud native of Lyon in France, where I grew up. And then after graduating, I've moved to the UK. I had a job back then. That's going back quite a few years now. I lived in and worked in London for about 7 years, and then had the opportunity to move to Australia, where I lived for about just short of 3 years. Then I moved back to France only to realize that just did not fit my expectations at the time. Then from there, I had a friend who was starting a business in North Africa and asked me to join him. And I thought, why not? So I joined him, and I spent 2 years working across North Africa, Senegal, and other parts of Africa. Then moved back to France, and yet again did not find that it was a right fit. So moved back to the UK for a few years. And after moving back to the UK in 2015, I moved to the US, and I lived and worked in New York with my family for about, again, short of 3 years. And then right after that, moved back to the UK, and I've been based in the UK ever since. I've been working in the learning industry for as long as I can remember. So I actually started in the IT industry, but then moved to the learning industry and absolutely loved it. Still love every minute of it because there's no status quo, because you learn so much about yourself, about others, and it is about people. So I guess ultimately I'm very fortunate to work in a business that has to do with people.
I just love how much you have lived in different places on different continents. And you are back in the UK. How was it to come back to a place that you've known before after living in so many different places?
It's funny because I often had that conversation, and very recently actually I was home for the holidays, and I was discussing with one of my cousins about what the future holds and where one would move. And I told him that I was still very much open to maybe living in another geography I've not had the opportunity to live in, and it's probably driven by two things. And I've not I'm not trying to dodge your question. I will answer your question, but I think I'm fundamentally very curious, and I just thoroughly enjoy working or living and spending time in a new environment where I get to learn more about people, their culture, their food, especially. I love food. So I don't know that I'm a foodie, but I certainly enjoy food. So I find that helps. But I probably, because I was fortunate enough to move into London when I was in my early 20s and then moved back into London in my 40s, that has kind of made London my go-to place. It's my home away from. In fact, I feel more attached or more anchored in London than I do in France. And it's probably driven by the fact that, to a certain extent, London is one of those places that is so cosmopolitan and belongs to so many people that you make it your home. So it doesn't matter where you come from or your background. You can still be a Londoner. You can still very much be defined by living and working in London. So I guess as much as I still would love to spend more time traveling and living in other countries, ultimately London is home.
And you have kids as well. You have shared in a previous conversation we had. Were they born in London? I can't remember.
It's no, and yes, we had that conversation because it's always very interesting because both my kids were born in France, but we moved here when they were both very, very young. One of them was only a couple of months old. The other one was about 18 months old. So they were both very young, and sometimes to my despair. So I'm hoping I'm not going to shock your listeners, but I had that realization recently. I had not a goal, but I almost a disappointing realization that my kids are Brits. And let me explain how that came about because it's quite funny. We were in France, and I one of the things I love about going back home, visiting my family, is the food, because that's so many memories are linked to biscuits and flavors and smells that I grew up with. So and I always want to share that with my kids. And I think we were buying crisps, so something very. And my kids just can't do all the flavors I love with crisps. They went for salt and vinegar, and for them that's the ultimate when it comes to flavors. So I was rather disappointed, telling them, "Oh my goodness," or something like Jaffa cakes. My son loves Jaffa cakes. I tried to teach him. We have that thing in France called PIMS. It's sorry if I'm doing brand naming here, and I think they're so much nicer than PIMS because I think the sponge cake is softer and fluffier and nicer, and I think the flavoring is not as sweet and more subtle. Nope, doesn't like them. He loves the Jaffa cakes that you can get here, but he would like from McVitie's, but he would not have the one we have back home. So it's funny to see how their taste buds have been defined by our life in the UK somehow.
I remember the first time I tried Jaffa cakes when I came to the UK as a student. I was like, oh, I was telling my housemate, oh, so those are pimps. They're like, pimps? No, this is not an alcohol. Biscuits.
I know it took me a while because that's when you realize all those names that we give in France. And when you think about it, it makes sense that in France we would call them PIMS because PIMS being a typical English drink, the biscuits probably are derived from the Jaffa cakes. But I just like with the croissant, where I love to tell people croissant is not a French invention. We just improved on an existing thing. I think it's the same thing with the PIMS. I think maybe McVitie's invented the Jaffa cakes. Then again, I would argue the name, maybe there's a clue in the name Jaffa. I don't believe Jaffa is in the UK, but maybe it's because of the orange flavor. And we just did the French version, just making them, at least for French taste buds, way nicer.
Yeah. So your kids are Brits then.
Let's not push it. I said their taste buds are. Again, it's interesting because we're talking about belonging, and I think it's not a challenge, but it's something that we both as parents would probably have to deal with our kids, just like our parents probably had to deal with us, because we discussed this, and we both have. My parents are Algerian and came from Algeria to France, where they met and where I was born, and therefore defining your identity when you live in a country other than the native country of where your parents are from is always a bit of a challenge, because how do you define oneself? It's not a concept. Typically, you define someone's identity by their roots, assuming that those roots are in the country where they live. So my kids will, as much as they're not, but they're actually legally not English because they hold French passports, but neither are they French. First of all, because one of them speaks French with a funny accent, even though they both speak perfect French, and actually way better English than I do. but they certainly don't feel that they are French, not in a 100% kind of way, but they're not Brits either. And then that makes it even more complicated because when they turn to their parents, well, how French am I really? And how can I tell them I'm French when their grandparents aren't French? And I made the decision to leave the country I was born and raised in. So it's a very interesting challenge for anyone to try and solve that question of identity when you don't naturally, or you don't feel you should be defined just by your place of birth, because we don't choose where we're born.
And being at the intersection of different cultures can be a gift, but it can also be challenging and difficult at times. How was it for you growing up, and how did it affect your sense of belonging, if you remember?
Okay, so we might fall into the politically incorrect here, but I'd rather be very honest. I'd say now in hindsight, I'm grateful. I'm glad because it certainly helped me, grow a very thick skin. But I guess from a parenting standpoint, it's tricky because I know how difficult it is. I think it is being human than to want to belong. We need to feel that we belong, and typically you want to try and start with where you live, so the very community where you are. And I think the challenge, at least for me, it's there's multiple reasons behind it, but growing up in a big council estate with lots of people from different backgrounds, and at a time where there was a lot of racism, so I've experienced that firsthand on multiple occasions, from being arrested without reason to I've had my fair share of really things that would wind someone up properly, and so for a long time I had a strong hatred that I couldn't really direct at anyone in particular, because it's very hard to try and identify it's so it's probably you turn it towards yourself because you don't understand why is it that I'm doing everything I'm being asked to do, and yet I'm not being accepted for who I am. And and you're really it's a tough one. I remember summer holidays when I would go and visit my grandmother in Algeria. I'd be called immigrant by the locals. I would not be seen as one of them because I came from France. But yet again, in France, I would not be allowed in nightclubs or student parties or different places because I was maybe too tanned, or didn't look the right way, or didn't come from the right place. So it's very hard for anyone to try and understand. Okay, so where does that put me? Why is it? What have I done to deserve that? But at the same time, it helps you grow a very thick skin. And at the same time, if that had not happened, maybe I wouldn't have been as keen as I was to leave as early as I did, to try and explore, elsewhere, to try and think, okay, if I'm not being accepted because I'm seen as an immigrant or whatever that might be, I might as well do that by choice, and then fully own up to the fact that I'm an immigrant. I've made the choice to live in a place that wasn't the place I was born or and raised in. So it's tough because you also need some luck, and I had a lot of luck along the way. I've met lots of wonderful people that helped and guided, and so it wasn't all dark. And I'm not certainly wouldn't want to fall into a Oliver Twist kind of story, but it's a very interesting, especially at this point in time in world politics, that identity crisis where how does one should define oneself. We literally just before we started that, we were talking about the World Cup, and I was telling you that what was very interesting with this year's World Cup, besides there's so many different aspects, but from a almost anthropologic standpoint, it was interesting to see more and more European team where now we could see players that came from different background, reflecting actually those various societies, and not necessarily having possible images of a country that looks just one way. And to that extent, I promise it's not a punt at the whole footballing thing, but I'm glad it was Harry Kane who missed the penalty against France when England lost. I honestly would say on record that I think England was the better team on the day. And I think it's unfair that it's Harry Kane that had to try and go for that penalty. But I'm glad that it's him, because if you remember what happened during the Euro,
Yeah.
if it had been like someone like, Saka or Rashford or one of those younger players taking the penalties, again, that would have opened the door for all the bigotry and all the racism that we've already seen during the Euro.
Yeah.
So I enjoy that this World Cup shown an image of the different countries as not one-sided as it had been for a long time, with the exception of France. But I think France always had and again, for the record, France is far from being a country that has, there's lots of racism, there's lots of sexism, there's a lot to be said. But from a sporting standpoint, France has always been very good in being able to use the very best of what they had within their society to make up their teams and athletes and sports heroes. With that specificity that France has always been very good at. Whenever things go well, players are always recognized as that French player. The minute things go south, then we automatically, the narrative is around like, what's their background? What island do they come from? Which former colonies do they come? Which is symptomatic of other issues we need to address.
Perhaps switching a little bit to the workplace and belonging and how it could show up in the workplace. You've also worked in different countries and different companies as well. What have you noticed? Are there any big things that you've noticed, or any learnings from the different places and locations you've worked in terms of belonging? How the corporate culture, of course, would impact belonging, but also the culture in which the company is in. Any thoughts or observations on that?
Yeah, no, so it's very interesting, and I'd say for the record that even though I was fortunate enough to work and live in different countries, it's always been in an Anglo-Saxon environment, which I think from a business and management standpoint will differ a lot from working in a French-led organization, for example. And I only have the one experience. I've had one spell of working in France. I've only worked once in my entire career in France for a French company, for a very large truck manufacturer. I'm not necessarily going to mention them, but where the culture was drastically different from what I had known before, simply because at least all the environments I had worked with, regardless of the country, people would be always judged first and foremost for their performance. So you belonging to any organization or any group would be always linked first, not uniquely, but linked to your ability to contribute in a constructive way to whatever the business goals were. And that, from that standpoint, that makes it very easy, or if not easy, simpler, because it's whenever you are added to the equation, is because you're going to help with whatever challenge you have in place. And when I was in France, it was interesting because it was very, very different, because it was more the work culture of that specific organization was linked to there's a French expression for that. They call it copinage.
Mm-hmm.
So it was linked to your network, your internal networking abilities, and your ability at navigating politics, much more than your actual work performance. And I remember that threw me. In fact, that's the only time ever in my entire career that I've resigned from a job, simply because it wasn't a great fit. Saying that, coming back to your question, what I found in the different places I've worked in is, and I think it's probably a rule of thumb for any kind of belonging, or whenever you want to go into any new environment, starting from a place of humility and almost vulnerability, and not going there thinking that I know it all and I'm going to solve it, and so being curious and candid about what you do not know, I think helps when it comes to belonging. Because I believe you appear far less threatening. That's always interesting. It's always good. and B, because it also allows you to like better understand all the silent rules that already exist within any group, and for you to fit within that group, for you to be able to understand, okay, and it doesn't mean you have to change yourself, but if you understand like, the unsaid rules, then it makes it easier for you to be able to adapt to that environment while hopefully still being, remaining true to yourself. And I think that's often the challenge when it comes to belonging is, the old saying, fake it till you make it. I think that might work for certain things, but not for belonging. I think if you're faking it just for the sake of belonging, then you're not belonging. I think you're fooling yourself more than anyone else. So it's, yeah, I'd say humility and curiosity, and accepting. And again, coming back to like your earlier point, Fiorenza, my growing up helped a great deal because I was always the outcast. I was always the one that did not belong, that would not be the right fit, that would not be accepted. So as a result, you build that capacity to try and learn and understand better others, so that you can fit without having anyone else feeling, I don't know, threatened or at unease about who you are.
The fitting in versus belonging, I guess, big debate or a big thing. And just how often it can show up. It shows up as we are growing up, but it also shows up again when we are in the corporate space, when we are working. Probably starts from a willingness, especially when we start a new job, that we want to do things well. Probably there's, a little bit of, we want to impress, or we want to make a good first impression. And then how that can lead us to actually being in the fitting in thing. It's a difficult one. I've worked in two different corporate settings. So both in London. One was a French headquartered company, but the London office. So yes, the culture of the office in London was more international, but it was still heavily French based. And the other one was really British. And I didn't realize the impact of the different cultures ahead of me starting in the very British one, and just how much I was adapting, making efforts to kind of understand the different references that were not necessarily matching my one. And there is such a thin line there between kind of you're really kind of be making all those efforts because you're the new kid around the block, and you just want to get to know your coworkers and get a good sense of the culture there, versus actually you are really fitting in. It is such a fine line. Personally, I would say that when I get a sense of like saying yes to like, have you seen this? Yes. Or like not being vocal about saying no, I have no idea what you're talking about, and pretending that you may have heard of it. That is probably like a huge red flag. Like you've been too much into the fitting in land there. Any thoughts on that? Does any of this resonate?
Well, I was sadly yes, but I was going to ask you, because I know we're talking about the corporate environment, but if you think about it, first day in secondary school, first day in high school, first day at uni, typically you're being taken and dropped in an environment where it's new and you still have to fit in, and therefore you want to belong and not look like the new first year kind of thing, but be more at ease. So did you have that feeling when you went from like the French to the British company, and how did your previous even academic experiences helped, if they helped?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say the only time where it's been kind of a struggle and I was really, really fitting in was in primary school. And it's crazy because I, kind of remember it. It's not super clear, but I remember, some of the feelings. So probably something that isn't very common in the UK, but I think it was still kind of happening in France in the 90s. So I skipped a class in primary school. So I think it would be the equivalent of year 4, probably, that I skipped.
So that puts you like in a class with much older kids
Yeah,
versus your
1
age
year
group.
older. That's right. And that was, I guess, difficult in the, with friendships and um, feeling that I belonged with that group of kids. The academic part, that was kind of following the process, and whatever the support that I needed was there, and that wasn't an issue. But it was more kind of, I yeah, I felt kind of singled out, or the other kids would single me out, right? Oh, she's the one that, blah, blah, blah. And I guess in inside, it wasn't really about the academic. Like, the kids didn't really care about that. It was more like a fuss was made around it. Like, I was introduced as the new kid, where actually, like, if a kid would move from another city and would get into the classroom, the the teachers wouldn't actually introduce that kid in the same way. And so the, quite a fuss was made about it to actually help me, but I don't think it helped. It really did the contrary. And that year, I was really kind of fitting in and pretending, a lot, just to kind of find that sense of belonging there.
But did you?
Not really. I don't think so. I don't really have like strong, friendship memories for that year. But thankfully, it was the last year of primary school. So the next year was a fresh start anyway for everyone.
So, but that's interesting. So, do you feel? I mean, since it is still very vivid in your memory, that has helped you maybe build the skills to better adapt to a new environment, and fit. I don't like saying fitting in, because what does that mean? But at least allow you to feel that you belonged. Do you feel like you've developed a set of skills from then on?
So I think that it made me aware that I needed and I wanted to find a group of people that I belonged with. And I realized that I wouldn't be, at the time, I would just say I wouldn't be friends with everyone. So I wouldn't, belong to any group. But the year after, did I find the right group for me? Probably not. But it did. It may have actually. This is the first time that I'm articulating this, so thank you, Mehdi. I think it triggered my search of finding my people, and yeah, I have found kind of my people, like in different places. But maybe it made the search a quest in some aspects, and find and I say quest in the sense that maybe the bar that I put was too high, and even now at times, right, it is still
Because I was going to ask,
too
that's
high.
the fascinating thing, because
Yeah.
you see anyone that you interview that is in my shoes, we typically belong to a very classical mode of working within the corporate environment. So especially, and we're all creatures of habit. So you're within one industry, you stay within the same industry, within the same role, and you just evolve within that role or that industry. And for most of us, that's the case. And therefore, that sense of belonging at a wider scope is easier. We're all humans, and then we're all humans within a continent, and then we're all within the same working industry, within the same, all of those things, and then we can narrow it down to like, I belong to that team. But you're in a very different journey, because you made the choice of like, which I totally understand, and I told you I really admire, of saying, I'm not in something that is fulfilling for me, even though you might have felt belonging within the group you were in, to go and become a coach. And by default, being a coach also means that you're not going to necessarily belong in the classical sense
Yeah.
to a group, team, company that defines you. I mean, your own company to a certain extent, and then there's probably that extended family of the coaching world. But see, my day to day, I have my own team that I manage, and I feel a very strong bond to the team, and I'll do everything for my team to feel that they belong. And then there's the extended team, and then there's the department, and within our company, and we're very much defined by that. But the rules are fairly straightforward. You don't have that. You don't have that safety net of, because when you go from one job to the other, then it's a more drastic cutoff from, I'll go from my team to the extended team, but I'm still within that same environment.
Yeah. And the crazy thing is, so yes to all you've said, and the crazy thing is probably I feel that I can be myself the most since I'm not working for a corporate, and I'm a coach and I have my own business. And I don't mean that in the in the sense of I can work the hours that I want and blah blah blah. I don't mean that
No.
in that way, but really kind of, yeah, I like something, I don't like something, I whatever I think, whatever, maybe it's controversial, I don't know, but I can just say that and kind of move along when I find people that do not share the same views or ideas or values. I don't have to stick with it. Do you see what I mean?
Totally, but I'm at the same time, I'm thinking to myself that maybe the whole question around belonging is, maybe we're not asking the right question. Maybe that whole belonging should start with the self. And you would be a good example of that, because you don't have to be defined by a team or a company you work for because you're self-employed. And yet that should not prevent you from feeling that sense of belonging. And maybe sense of belonging starts with, like, I feel I belong to, like, what my calling is versus the team I'm part of, the organization or the company I work for.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And I think for me, that's exactly in that order. It is still important for me now and in my work that I really belong to groups. So you mentioned kind of, belonging to the, being part of the wider coaching space. Yes. And also I have like smaller groups that I can turn to. I mean, I wouldn't. So we define ourselves as a mastermind to kind of start with, but now we are friends and colleagues and challenging each other in so different roles. But it really does have it does kind of foster a sense of belonging a lot. And it's fascinating because there's five of us and we are from different paths of life, not living in the same city or country. So that's quite fascinating. But we are, bro. I mean, our, I guess, on paper, common point is the work that we do, and then finding also the right people to collaborate with on different projects. Of course, the podcast is an example, right? So the each guest of the podcast is someone that inspires me for different reason each time, but there's always that. And also any kind of project that I would work on for my work would also have this thing extra, right? If there is someone else there with me that could foster that sense of belonging. Yeah.
I think that's fascinating. And so if you'll allow me, I want to come back to something that we had discussed when we first met, and it's that commonality. But so from your standpoint, because you also share a dual background, and then you also decided to, like, move and live in a country that is not the one you grew up with or that is part of your heritage. So now that you have a son, if your son were to ask you, like, what are you? And I don't mean in a metaphysical sense, and we're not going to, like, Nietzsche or anything like that. But much more, what do you define yourself as? French living in England, French Italian. What defines you?
It's as you know, it's a very difficult question. I do, I you know, I don't know what I would say. I wouldn't feel comfortable just saying French and leaving at that for sure, because so many times now I'm catching myself thinking English, which is crazy, and being more comfortable in expressing something in English, which is also crazy. Yeah, that and yeah, I do recognize that I on many topics I'm not up to date in how things are done, or are where they're at in France. We were talking just about, we started the recording, the whole DNI topic and how it's done in France. I'm not up to date with that, right? So I think, I don't know, it makes me feel a little bit of an imposter saying that I'm French, and probably the same with saying French Italian. I've never lived in Italy, although I know a lot about the Italian culture and the Italian reference. It cannot replace growing up, having your formative years in the country, or following the whatever kids or teenager cultural references, right? That you may have when you grew up in a place. So yeah, so I mean, things are not completely different, right? I mean, there are a lot of things anyway that a French kid and Italian kid would know, but still there are differences. So yeah, it's I don't think I can give a bottom line answer to my son whenever he's going to ask the question. But there will certainly be an element of, kind of Londonness. I'm not sure about Britishness, because I do think that London is so international and the most, at least in my experience, welcoming in England with international people. And yeah, Scotland is different. I think, yeah, probably, from what I've seen and experience of Scotland, that's also very welcoming. And yeah, it would be a nice place to be there too. Yeah, I mean, all the years, more than a decade in London, I can't just erase
No,
that.
you can't. But that's and I'm asking it literally because I'm both my kids being teenagers. I'm being often challenged on things, and I'm being told and asked me, like, but Dad, you can't say that. You're not that, or we're not that, and and I'm finding myself, yeah, very much challenged because I don't have the answer. I can't. When I'll tell them, you guys are French, they go, no, we're not. We've never lived there. We only go there to see our grandparents, and we speak the language, but it's not because you speak a language that you're part of that culture.
Yeah.
And it's even further away without their grandparents' culture. And yet there's a bit of all of that just makes up who they are. So the reality is, if you choose to stay in London for the foreseeable future, as much as your son would be a Londoner, maybe, I don't know, was he born in England?
Yeah.
So technically speaking, English, but by being raised by his parents, there would be that French dimension to it. And then, because of his grandparents or your own heritage, there would be that. And it's all of that. Now, I think probably, and that's what I have we discussed about, even because it does happen less. It's funny how things work when you're getting older, because two things happen I've noticed, and that's probably my 5 cents worth of wisdom for the whole podcast. The first thing is, I have far less patience for things that are stupid or make no sense to me. So where once upon a time I'd try and answer and be polite and avoid, now I just dismiss them as in, couldn't, life's too short. I just no, not interested. But at the same time, because I'm getting older, I get less question on silly things like where you from, but yeah, I know you said you're French, but where exactly? And then you said, well, I was born in Lyon. And yeah, but you know what I mean? I mean, what's your background? What? So those things I'm getting less, but they still happen. And I'm still being questioned. And sometimes you can see people trying to tread carefully, but at the same time, they probably that makes them even more clumsy on the approach. by questioning you on that. And maybe ultimately, I'd like to think that we'll get to a stage where, at least for our kids' sake, that you'll just be taken at face value. It doesn't really matter where you were born and where your parents are from, and what other languages.
Yeah.
And then maybe it's very, maybe I'm this utopian of me, and I'd like to think if that can save them a lot of the hassle and heartache that one has to go through, try and just justify who you are, just that you can be valued, or sometimes how people just react to you, certain things you might say or do, and all of a sudden you're being seen completely different. And I think for younger people, that can be more damaging and more hurting. And I certainly wouldn't wish it on my kids or anyone else for that matter, that, all of a sudden they go from being appreciated to being seen differently just because they don't eat this or they don't. I think when it comes to belonging, that's another thing as well, where it's maybe we should stick more to the basics,
Yeah.
with people. It's so as a side note, it's funny because once upon a time I've contemplated, and I don't think it ever happened, but there was a group that was trying to create a citizenship that essentially makes you just a world citizen. I did contemplate just having a passport that would make me essentially a world citizen, where I've got no allegiance to any specific nation or politics. But again, I think that's the dreamer in me that just has those ideal.
One question that I wanted to ask you is, what are the factors or the elements that you need to see or to have in any given situation, to feel that you belong?
Well, I think it's two things. It's on one hand not necessarily not being afraid of being a bit more vulnerable, and being able to accept that, I've got weaknesses. It's funny because we talk about being vulnerable, but I think that's being super strong and super brave, just to be able to just put it out there and say that's my limits. But I think that helps a great deal. I think that it's almost like a peace offering, if you will, to like any group when it comes to belonging, because it's far less threatening for the other side. But then the other thing is maybe selfishness, and not selfishness in the sense of it's me, myself, and I, but just being able to accept that I should be fully content with who I am, and not necessarily have to be accepted and embraced by everyone to be able to feel I belong. Ultimately, we belong. You breathe the same air as everyone else, so you should be able to feel that you belong. And again, I know we borderline in the idealistic, but I think your example is a great example. I think it's if you start by just accepting you for who you are, that's a big step towards belonging, because the risk otherwise is that you can only be defined by the others and the group, and then almost and therefore you're denying your being because you're thinking I'm not being accepted. And the reality is, the larger the group, the more complex the environment, the harder it will be to feel 100% acceptance and belonging, just because it's the nature of the beast. It's easier to belong to a team of 2 people than it is to a group of 5,000. It's just the way it is. I have to be able to just accept who I am, and accept that I'm not going to, I can be part of a group where for example, politically, I know that there's a lot of my colleagues I strongly disagree with, but that's the beauty of it. That's what I like about it. That's a lot. I want to be in an environment where not everything and everyone sees the same way, see the same format. And I just as a side note, but we had that very conversation, Fiorenza, about that weird concept that is quite unique to France of integration, where essentially, in order to belong, you have to be in total denial of everything else that is not what defines the consensus within what makes you French in that case. And for me, that's that's wrong. That's not the right approach to anything. I think, for anyone to belong, there should be room allowed for those people to be different, because it's from that diversity that you get a much better group, but you can still belong. We don't have to agree on everything to belong.
Yeah.
We have to agree on some key things, but you should still be entitled to your own preferences and your own beliefs and there's an old TV show called, was it called the fourth or the fifth that I mentioned? I can't remember. It was a black and white TV show. And I remember one specific episode that guy that was upset at people, and then he makes that stupid wish. He says, I wish everyone was like me. And then he wakes up the next day and everyone is like him and thinks like him. And it turns out to be the worst nightmare ever, because that's not what you'd want. So I think to belong, you have to accept that it's not about thinking and dressing and doing everything the same as the others. It's also keeping your own individuality, being able to accept that we're not going to agree on everything.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much, Mehdi. And thank you for being such an amazing guest and actually helping me articulate some of my stuff as well. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for teaching. I think it's that's what I love about your podcast, is that I think you've been very good at just putting me and other guests at ease, that we can just open up and just be very true to ourselves and just say things as we feel them. And I think that allows for a deeper and far more constructive conversation. And from a listener standpoint, at least for me, listening to our previous episodes, it also helped me better reflect and accept, that I'm far from knowing it all and from understanding everything. And self-reflection is not an easy thing, but a very important one. And I think that helps trigger those thoughts and those questions in people. So thank you for that.
You can follow the podcast on LinkedIn at the Belonging Project Podcast. You can also hit subscribe and stay up to date with our episodes. And do feel free to get in touch with me on coaching@fiorenzarossini.com. Thank you again, and see you next time.